David Lawley, who's a documentary filmmaker. David's work includes the Alternative Iraq Inquiry. In May 2012, many of you will remember, David interrupted the Leveson inquiry during Tony Blair's statement, alleging that Blair had been paid off by the American bank JP Morgan Chase for agreeing to take the United Kingdom into the Iraq War. Blair denied the charge. Take a look at what happened.
Excuse me, this man should be arrested for war crimes. JP Morgan paid him off for the Iraq War. 3 months after we invaded Iraq, they held up the Iraq Bank for $20 billion. He was then paid $6 million every year and still is from JP Morgan 6 months after he left office. The man is a war criminal.
Well, that was David Lawley dramatic entrance into the Leveson inquiry. David, I believe we have you online now. So yesterday must have been a bit of a vindication for you as well.
Because the entire British public, in fact most of the public of the world, know and understand that Tony Blair is a war criminal. Not just for, as you said earlier, ignoring the advice of the intelligence, but for spinning the advice with his spin doctors and exaggerating it to such an extent that he took us to a war on a premise, on a lie. We know he lied, and my argument is that he knew fully well that he stood to make money on the back of that war.
Yeah, it's not a wonderful connection, David, unfortunately, but I can just about hear you and see you. So one of your main points that you wanted to make was that subsequent to leaving the office, Tony Blair went on to literally make millions.
Yeah. The point is that in his third term in office, he had plenty of time to plan for when he was going to leave.
David, I think we're going to try and get you on the phone line. Unfortunately, the Skype connection is really bad, and we can't hear you or see you clearly. So just a reminder that we're talking about the Chilcot inquiry today and Tony Blair. In my opinion, he stands condemned. But it's not enough that he just stands condemned. He needs to be, there needs to be consequences for what he did. There needs to be action taken for what he did. And that means that he should be tried in a court. And if the ICC, the International Court, won't do it, perhaps the British courts can. The International Criminal Court, of course, has a track record of convicting and trying black people from Africa, African dictators. Doesn't seem to, try and convict any white people. Perhaps they can make an exception with Tony Blair. But if the ICC won't do it, and they probably won't do it because, as you know, Tony Blair is still very well politically connected, perhaps the British courts can do it. I'm sure that some of those soldiers' families, I think 173 British soldiers were killed in Iraq, and their families are uniformly incredibly upset at Tony Blair. Perhaps they will launch an action. I'm sure they're already talking to lawyers, and I really hope that Tony Blair will be pursued and dogged by lawyers until his dying day. I think we might have David Lawley back on a phone connection this time, which might be a little bit better than the Skype. David, are you there?
Yes, hi there, Roshan.
Hi, I can hear you loud and clearly. Go ahead, David.
Good, yes, no, as I was saying, I thought it was absolutely clear that Tony Blair knew that he stood to make money afterwards, straight after he left office. In fact, a few months afterwards, the Kuwaiti, Saddam Hussein's old enemies, the royal family of Kuwait, apparently for advice, gave him over $20 million, between $20 and $30 million. And this is out in the public domain. It's all over the internet. You can see it. He then later that year signed a deal with a Korean oil firm. There were bombs going off in Baghdad pretty much daily at the time, later in 2007. And whilst he was actually signing deals with a Korean oil firm who had extensive dealings with the drilling that was going on in southern Iraq, as well as others. There were other deals. And of course, my claim that JP Morgan paid him off. Well, JP Morgan, the biggest bank in one of the biggest banks in the world, propped up the Iraq economy after the invasion. And Iraq is still paying back to this day, through its oil revenue, the loan that JP Morgan lent it at that time to rebuild the country.
I mean, David, I'm not privy to your information, so I can't really comment on it. I guess I'm just taking your word for it. But what is true is that since leaving office, This guy has gone on to make tens of millions of pounds, perhaps more than that, property empire all over the world. And he's done that on the back of his reputation as a war prime minister, right?
Well, yes, that's correct. It is as a former prime minister, and some of those dealings I don't negate him. You know, property deals, fair enough. But when the companies that he's dealing with have direct links with the oil revenues coming out of Iraq whilst people are being bombed, I find it absolutely disgraceful. And I think that was the problem with the Chilcot inquiry. What the British establishment does when they don't want to have a criminal investigation is they have an inquiry, which is, at the end of the day, nothing really can be done except, as you say, let's hope those lawyers from the families of the British soldiers will continue this
David,
on and take it on and on.
Do you think the kind of British establishment are hoping that this is the end of it now? You know, they've condemned Tony Blair and they've publicly humiliated him, but they're not going to actually put him in a court on trial. Is this the end of it, or are we going to actually see a prosecution?
Well, this is a good question. There's a lot of Alex Salmond from the Scottish Nationalist Party is trying to get and impeach Tony Blair from a very old law that goes through Parliament back in the early 1920s or 30s or so, which could in fact impeach him, but which gets him kicked out, and he could never stand again in the House of Lords or the House of Commons. But that again is not a criminal investigation. After 600,000 Iraqis died, and plus more still dying today, he should be in a solitary confinement for the rest of his life, in a prison somewhere in Europe.
And David, I must ask you to respond to what Blair himself said yesterday after the Chilcot report was released. I mean, he basically said that he expressed regret for the post-invasion chaos, but he says that it was the right thing to do. He still maintains it was the right thing to do to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and the world is a better place without Saddam Hussein.
Yes, of course. Had Bush and Blair come to the British people and the American people and said, we are going to Iraq to change the regime, and they'd gone to the United Nations to try and get a Security Council resolution to change that regime and done it honestly, they would never have got that Security Council resolution. And Paul Wolfowitz, who was one of the neoconservative advisors to Bush at the time, actually let this slip in a Vanity Fair interview back later on, that in fact they came up with this weapons of destruction, because basically it was the one story that couldn't be proved. You know, everyone knows this conspiracy. The law in the International Criminal Court is crimes against peace, and the second part of that is conspiracy to crimes against peace, and that is what Blair is guilty of.
And David, do you think that Britain, the British government, the British people will learn the lessons from this war? I mean, what are the lessons, and will they learn them?
Well, the lessons to learn are, look, everybody in the world, every country, every government is corrupt at some level or another. But when that corruption leads to just losing one human being's life, then that's where the line has to be drawn. If people are caught telling lies about taking a country into a war where anyone is going to lose their life, they should be taken to court and tried and dealt with it in the correct fashion.
And David, just kind of wrapping up now, but you know, in terms of British imperialism, are we gonna learn the lessons of not invading any more countries in the future?
Well, no. Again, you see, they still carry on doing it. You heard Cameron talking about the 70,000 Syrian moderates that were going to come and fight on our behalf against Assad. So that was another lie. It does that the 70,000 moderates are, of course, they were the old Syrian, the Syrian people, but there's not an army there over in Syria waiting for us to come and back them. It's lies. They don't seem to learn from their mistakes.
Well,
that's the whole point. You know?
Okay. Thanks a lot for your time, and thanks a lot for your wisdom there, David. What I would add to that, the only thing I would add to that is, I fear too that actually the real lessons will not be learned. Because for me, the real lesson from the Iraq War was that Western intervention in the Middle East does not work. It leads to further chaos, it devastates societies, it engenders terrorism, and it literally destroys people's lives and countries. But we saw the West go into Libya in 2011. Exactly the same thing happened. Okay, it wasn't as large a scale of invasion and occupation as Iraq was, but look at Libya 5 years later, a devastated country torn apart by terrorists, militias running amok. And even now, those people, some people who are otherwise good people, perhaps on the left of the political spectrum, perhaps even some Muslims, even now they're still calling for the West to invade Syria. I mean, when are they going to get it through to their skulls that the West has no business invading Middle Eastern countries? They don't understand what they're getting into. It's none of their business. They cause havoc. They cause death and destruction. So please, 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 if there's one lesson we learn from Iraq and Libya, is no to Western intervention in the Middle East. Now, aside from Tony Blair, there were many others responsible for taking the UK into an illegal war in 2003. So we prepared a rogues gallery, and here it is. Hopefully that'll flash up on the comment wall sometime soon. The first guy is the British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, or he was the Foreign Secretary at the time of Tony Blair, sorry. And he signed up to plans for an invasion despite fearing there could be a long and unsuccessful war. That's what the Chilcot report found. The report also criticised Straw's role in the deeply flawed process of preparing for post-crisis Iraq. Now, the second member of this rogues gallery is, of course, Alistair Campbell, who was Tony Blair's master spin doctor and one of the most controversial figures at the time. He was involved in drafting of 2 Downing Street dossiers on the war, on the possibility of Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. He was then at the centre of the row over the death of weapons expert David Kelly after the BBC broadcast allegations that Blair's office had included details in the Iraq dossier which they knew to be untrue. And Alistair Campbell, unfortunately, is still unrepentant. Our third member of the Rogues Gallery is Sir John Scarlett, who was chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee at the time of the 2003 invasion. So basically he was a spy. He was involved in drawing up the dossiers on Iraq, so-called WMDs, non-existent WMDs, and received criticism in the wake of the scandal over David Kelly's death as a result. Since leaving the service in 2009, he's advised PricewaterhouseCoopers, Morgan Stanley, and a host of other multinationals, probably getting himself very rich in the process. We're going to move on to Peter Goldsmith, who was Tony Blair's Attorney General from 2001 to 2007 and played an important role in providing the government with advice relating to the legality of the war. He admitted at Chilcot to changing his advice to the Prime Minister in the weeks before the 2003 invasion. Up until March 2003, he had recommended seeking the approval of a fresh UN resolution, describing this as a safer option. And then he changed his mind, probably under political pressure. And finally, the last members of our Rogues Gallery are 2 press barons, Rupert Murdoch on the right and Paul Dacre. Rupert Murdoch, obviously the owner of The Sun, the owner of The Times. Paul Dacre, the editor of the Daily Mail, which is a hugely successful and mass circulation tabloid. And these guys basically sold the war to a skeptical public. So they laid the ground for the war. So those are our Rogues Gallery. Hopefully they'll concentrate who's really guilty and who isn't in this